My dear friends, President Cyril Ramaphosa, Excellencies, distinguished cabinet guests, friends. It is a privilege to join you in honoring Nelson Mandela, an extraordinary global leader, advocate, and role model. I thank the Nelson Mandela Foundation for this opportunity and commend their work to keep his vision alive. And I send my deepest condolences to the Mandela family and to the government and people of South Africa on the untimely passing of Ambassador Zinzi Mandela earlier this week. May she rest in peace. I was fortunate enough to meet Nelson Mandela several times. I will never forget his wisdom, determination, and compassion, which shone forth in everything he said and did. Last August, in my holidays, I visited Madiba's cell at Robben Island. I stood there, looking through the bars, humbled again by his enormous mental strength and incalculable courage. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, 18 of them at Robben Island. But he never allowed this experience to define him or his life. Nelson Mandela rose above his jailers to liberate millions of South Africans and become a global inspiration and a modern icon. He devoted his life to fighting the inequality that has reached crisis proportions around the world in recent decades and that poses a growing threat to our future. And so today, on Madiba's birthday, I will talk about how we can address the many mutually reinforcing strands and layers of inequality before they destroy our economies and societies. Dear friends, COVID-19 is shining a spotlight on this injustice. The world is in turmoil, economies are in free fall, and we have been brought to our knees by a microscopic virus. The pandemic has demonstrated the fragility of our world. It has laid bare risks we have ignored for decades: inadequate health systems, gaps in social protection, structural inequalities, environmental degradation, the climate crisis. Entire regions that were making progress on eradicating poverty and narrowing inequality have been set back years in a matter of months. The virus poses the greatest risk to the most vulnerable, those living in poverty, older people, and people with disabilities and pre-existing conditions. And health workers are on the front lines with more than 4,000 infected in South Africa alone. I pay tribute to them. In some countries, health inequalities are amplified as not just private hospitals, but businesses and even individuals are ordering precious equipment that is urgently needed for everyone. A tragic example of inequality. The economic fallout of the pandemic is affecting those who work in the informal economy, small and medium-sized businesses, and people with caring responsibilities who are mainly women. We face the deepest global recession since World War II and the broadest collapse in incomes since 1870. 100 million more people could be pushed into extreme poverty, and we could see famines of historic proportions. COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies, falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat. Because while we are all floating on the same sea, it is clear that some are in super yachts, with others are clinging to drifting debris. Dear friends, inequality defines our time. More than 70% of the world's people are living with rising income and wealth inequality. The 26 richest people in the world hold as much wealth as half the global population. But income, pay, and wealth are not the only measures of inequality. People's chances in life depend on their gender, family and ethnic background, race, whether or not they have a disability, and other factors. Multiple inequalities intersect and reinforce each other across the generations. The lives and expectations of millions of people are largely determined by their circumstances at birth. In this way, inequality works against human development for everyone. We all suffer its consequences. High levels of inequality are associated with economic instability, corruption, financial crisis, increased crime, and poor physical and mental health. Discrimination, abuse, and lack of access to justice define inequality for many, particularly indigenous people, migrants, refugees, and minorities of all kinds. Such inequalities are a direct assault on human rights. Addressing inequality has therefore been a driving force throughout history for social justice, labor rights, and gender equality. The vision and promise of the United Nations is that food, health care, water and sanitation, education, decent work, and social security are not commodities for sale to those who can afford them, but basic human rights to which we are all entitled. We work to reduce inequality every day, everywhere. And that vision is as important today as it was 75 years ago. It is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, our agreed blueprint for peace and prosperity on a healthy planet. And captured in Sustainable Development Goal 10, reduce inequality within and between countries. Dear friends, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, many people around the world understood that inequality was undermining their life chances and opportunities. They saw a world out of balance. They felt left behind. They saw economic policies channeling resources upwards to the privileged few. Millions of people from all continents took to the streets to make their voices heard. High and rising inequalities were a common factor. The anger feeding tourist and social movements reflects utter disillusionment with the status quo. Women everywhere have called time on one of the most egregious examples of gender inequality. Violence perpetrated by powerful men against women who are simply trying to do their jobs. And the anti-racist movement that has spread from the United States around the world in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing is one more sign that people have had enough. Enough of inequality and discrimination that treats people as criminals on the basis of their skin color. Enough of the structural racism and systematic injustice that deny people their fundamental human rights. These movements point to two of the historic sources of inequality in our world: colonialism and patriarchy. The global north, especially my own continent of Europe, imposed colonial rule on much of the global south for centuries through violence and coercion. Colonialism created vast inequality within and between countries, including the evils of the transatlantic slave trade and the apartheid regime here in South Africa. After the Second World War, the creation of the United Nations was based on a new global consensus around equality and human dignity, and the wave of decolonization swept the world. But let's not fool ourselves. The legacy of colonialism still reverberates. We see this in the economic and social injustice, the rise of hate crimes and xenophobia, the persistence of institutionalized racism and white supremacy. We see this in the global trade system. Economies that were colonized are at greater risk of getting locked into the production of raw materials and low-tech goods, a new form of colonialism. And we see this in global power relations. Africa has been a double victim. First, as a target of the colonial project. Second, African countries are underrepresented in the international institutions that were created after the Second World War, because before most of them had won independence. The nations that came out on top more than 7 decades ago have refused to contemplate the reforms needed to change power relations in international institutions. The composition and voting rights in the United Nations Security Council and the boards of the Bretton Woods system are a case in point. Inequality starts at the top, in global institutions. Addressing inequality must start by reforming them. And let's not forget another great source of inequality in our world: millennia of patriarchy. We live in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture. Everywhere, women are worse off than men simply because they are women. Inequality and discrimination are the norm. Violence against women, including femicide, is at epidemic levels. And globally, women are still excluded from senior positions in governments and on corporate boards. Fewer than 1 in 10 world leaders is a woman. Gender inequality harms everyone because it prevents us from benefiting from the intelligence and experience of all of humanity. This is why, as a proud feminist, I have made gender equality a top priority and gender parity now a reality in top UN jobs. I urge leaders of all kinds to do the same. And I am pleased to announce that South Africa's Siya Kolisi is our new global champion for the United Nations European Union Spotlight Initiative, engaging other men in fighting the global scourge of violence against women and girls. Dear friends, recent decades have created new tensions and trends. Globalization and technological change have indeed fueled enormous gains in income and prosperity, and more than 1 billion people have moved out of extreme poverty. But the expansion of trade and technological progress have also contributed to an unprecedented shift in income distribution. Between 1980 and 2016, the world's richest 1% captured 27% of the total cumulative growth in income. Low-skilled workers face an onslaught from new technologies, automation, the offshoring of manufacturing, and the demise of labor organizations. Tax concessions, tax avoidance, and tax evasion remain widespread. Corporate tax rates have fallen. And this has reduced resources to invest in the very services that can reduce inequality: social protection, education, healthcare. And the new generation of inequalities goes beyond income and wealth to encompass the knowledge and skills needed to succeed in today's world. Deep disparities begin before birth and define lives and early death. More than 50% of 20-year-olds in countries with very high human development are in higher education. In low human development countries, that figure is 3%. Even more shocking, some 17% of the children born 20 years ago in countries with low human development have already died. Dear friends, looking to the future, two seismic shifts will shape the 21st century: the climate crisis and digital transformation. Those could widen inequalities even further. Some of the developments in today's tech and innovation hubs are cause for serious concern. The heavily male-dominated tech industry is not only missing out on half the world's expertise and perspectives, it is also using algorithms that could further enhance gender and racial discrimination. The digital divide reinforces social and economic divides from literacy to healthcare, from urban to rural, from kindergarten to college. In 2019, some 87% of people in developed countries use the internet, compared with just 19% in the least developed countries. We are in danger of a two-speed world. At the same time, by 2050, we estimate that accelerating climate change will affect millions of people through malnutrition, malaria and other diseases, migration, and extreme weather events. This creates serious threats to intergenerational equality and justice. Today's young climate protesters are on the front lines of the fight against inequality. The countries that are most affected by climate disruption did the least to contribute to global heating. The green economy will be a new source of prosperity and employment. But let's not forget that some people will lose their jobs, particularly in post-industrial rust belts of our world. And this is why we call not only for climate action, but climate justice. Political leaders must raise their ambition, businesses must raise their sights, and people everywhere must raise their voices. There is a better way, and we must take it. Dear friends, the corrosive effects of today's levels of inequality are clear. We are sometimes told a rising tide of economic growth lifts all boats. But rising inequality sinks all boats. Confidence in institutions and leaders is eroding. Voter turnout has fallen by a global average of 10% since the beginning of the 90s. And people who feel marginalized and vulnerable to arguments that blame their misfortune on others, particularly those who look or behave differently. But populism, nationalism, extremism, racism, and scapegoating will only create new inequalities and divisions within and between communities, between countries, between ethnicities, between religions.